Hey, what's going on, everybody? So, I thought I'd make a video on the grand jury. Now, I have actually covered this material already in several other videos, but this topic continues to pop up, and because it continues to pop up, I thought that it makes sense to have a video stand on its own to cover the topic of grand jury. And that way, I wouldn't have to reference another video that's on another subject matter in order to give you some of the points of the grand jury. So, with that said, let's just go ahead and get into it. So, the grand jury is covered in Article 5 of the United States Constitution, and I have that here before me now. So, I'm just going to read it verbatim. It goes on to say, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be put twice in jeopardy of life and limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." So there's a lot in the I guess, in the Fifth Amendment or article, or the fifth article of the United States Constitution. Grand jury, the jury clause is only one of the clauses there. Of course, there is the Fifth Amendment, which is typically known as a right to not bear witness against yourself. And there's also double jeopardy in the same amendment. But this particular video, we're focusing on the grand jury. And one thing you should notice is that you don't need a grand jury if the case is involved in land or the naval forces, so the army, and you don't need a grand jury if it involves the militia. Now, I actually find this pretty interesting, and I'm not gonna get into why, but I'll just throw this out here. We have a lot of situations where militias are involved in shootings of protesters and things of that nature. So it's kind of interesting to see how the authorities will handle prosecuting individuals who were purported to be a part of the militia, and then they've shot someone. But that's not what this video is about. This video is just really about the raw coverage of the grand jury. So there it is in the raw. This is Article 5, or the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which talks about the grand jury, and of course it talks about several other things. So I have some case law which gets into the secrecy of the grand jury. And one of the things you should notice is that the Constitution says that there should be a grand jury, but it doesn't say whether or not the grand jury should be secret. And that led me to do a little bit of research into how the secrecy came about, the grand jury, and then the actual purpose of the secrecy of the grand jury. And one of the things I actually found from doing some research is that the grand jury actually didn't start off as a secrecy. We get our grand jury, like we get most of our laws, from England. And when the grand jury was first created, I think it was around 1166, it wasn't done so in secrecy. It was just simply tasks given to members of the crown, or I shouldn't say crown. There were simply tasks given to individuals so that they can serve out the king's work. The king would routinely want to know who were committing crimes, and he would rely on these individuals to bring people before the crown to be formally charged, and then they would, have to survive the charges. And as you know, back in those times, there wasn't really a hearing around 1166. You would just have to survive the court process, the trial by nature process, and if you survived, then you would be innocent. You'd probably be maimed, probably missing an arm and leg, but you'd be innocent. So, at any rate, the king relied on these individuals to let him know who was committing crimes, and then, of course, there would be a trial. And then, somewhere along the lines, secrecy was developed to basically protect the individuals, the accused individuals, from the abuse of the crown. So that was actually the purpose of the grand jury, was to protect people from the king, right? So if people were going to be accused, they would want to have a some fairness in the process to basically protect people from the king, from just being abused. So when this eventually reaches over to United States, then the secrecy takes on a different meaning, and that's where we get into this case law. And it goes on to say the purpose of a grand jury secrecy, as enshrined in Rule 6E, is to ensure the proper functioning of the grand jury system. The Supreme Court has articulated a number of interests served by this secrecy. First, if pre-indicted proceedings were made public, many prospective witnesses would be hesitant to come forward voluntarily, knowing that those against whom they testify would be aware of that testimony. Moreover, witnesses who appear before the grand jury would be less likely to testify fully and frankly, as they would be open to retribution as well as to inducements. There would also be the risk that those about to be indicted would flee, or would try to influence individual grand jurors to vote against the indictment. Finally, by preserving the secrecy of the proceedings, we assure that persons who are accused but exonerated by the grand jury will not be held to up to public ridicule. Douglas Oil v. Petro Stops Northwest, right? So there you have it. So when the grand jury originally started out, it was really to protect the accused from the king, or from the abuse of the king, or the abuse for the crown. And once it came over to the United States, the purpose of the secrecy of the grand jury is to protect the actual individuals in the actual juror, right? And it's also to prevent people who are going to be indicted from trying to induce these jurors from testifying, or to induce them to vote against the indictment. So, and all of this kind of makes sense, but one thing you should take note of is the final parts of this. We assure that persons who are accused but exonerated by the grand jury will not be held up to public ridicule. So obviously, you don't want a system where the grand jurors can be manipulated or tampered with. And obviously, you don't want a situation where the grand jurors are going to be afraid to come and basically make a decision on whether or not to indict someone. And obviously, you don't want a situation where the witness are going to be afraid to come forward and give their testimony. So, this is basically the purpose of the grand jury. So now let's just go ahead and look at criminal rules of procedure for the grand jury. So the criminal rule of procedure, the federal criminal rules of procedure for the grand jury, is Rule 6, and it's basically called the grand jury. And it basically talks about summoning the grand jury in general. You must have 16 to 23 members in the grand jury, and the court must order that enough legally qualified persons be summoned to meet this requirement. Alternate jurors. When a grand jury is selected, the court may also select alternate jurors. Alternate jurors must have the same qualifications and be selected in the same manner as any other juror. Alternate jurors replaces jurors in the same sequence in which the alternates were selected. And an individual has a right to object to the grand jury. For example, the person being accused has a right to object to the grand jury. And Rule 6B covers the objections to the grand jury. It goes on to say objections to the grand jury or grand juror challenges. Either the government or a defendant may challenge the grand jury on the ground that it was not lawfully drawn, summoned, or selected, and may challenge an individual juror on the ground that the juror is not legally qualified. And typically, the person being indicted could file a motion to dismiss the indictment, right? A party may move to dismiss the indictment based on the objection to the grand jury or an individual juror's lack of legal qualification, unless the court has previously ruled on the same objection under Rule 6B1, right? The motion to dismiss is governed by 28 USC 1867E. The court must not dismiss the indictment on the grounds that the grand juror was not legally qualified if the records show that at least 12 qualified jurors concurred in the indictment, right? Uh, of course, every grand jury has a foreperson and a deputy, and this is one of the hard requirements for having a grand juror. And it talks about who may be present during the grand jury. While the grand jury is in session, the following persons may be present while the grand jury is in session: attorneys for the government, the witness being questioned, interpreters when needed, and a court reporter or an operator of the recording device. And basically, when you're being indicted and the grand jury is going to hear whether or not you should be indicted, you're not entitled to actually participate in those proceedings. Now, the Constitution talks about the grand jury, but it doesn't actually come out and tell you verbatim that you're not able to actually participate in these proceedings. And that's what, some of this rule is actually talking about. And most importantly, this rule talks about the secrecy. And it goes on to say, no obligation of secrecy may be imposed in any person except in accordance with Rule 6E 2B. Unless these rules provided otherwise, the following persons must not disclose a matter occurring before the grand jury. And then it goes on to say a juror, an interpreter, a court reporter, and an operator of the recording device, so on and so forth. So essentially they're trying to preserve the secrecy of the grand jury, and they have very strict rules on the secrecy and who can and cannot attend, right? And then it gives some exceptions for challenging the secrecy of the grand jury, and most of that is going to apply to the government, except for one of the particular clauses that allows for an individual to basically object to the grand jury. And the individual can object to the grand jury by filing a motion to dismiss, as we've actually already seen. So I just wanted to, have a really quick video to cover a grand jury and the purpose of the grand jury and what it means to basically draw up a grand jury. But as we're going to see in some other videos, we're going to talk about, or we're going to get deeper into grand jury secrecy, and we're going to talk about the impact of the secrecy behind the grand jury. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.